Rain hammered the windshield of a borrowed car, parked outside a glass tower that touched the clouds. Inside, Daniel Reyes gripped the steering wheel with hands that had spent the day fixing a stranger's plumbing for $40, and he stared at the gold-lettered sign above the entrance, Callaway Industries. He had no idea why a woman worth $9 billion had texted a number she shouldn't have had, asking him to come tonight, dressed in the only suit he owned. His daughter Mia, 6 years old, was asleep at his sister's apartment, clutching the stuffed rabbit he'd sewn back together twice. He thought of her now, of the rent due in 4 days, and he stepped out into the rain. Inside the lobby, a woman in a charcoal coat watched him through the glass before he saw her. Vivian Callaway did not do this. She did not approach strangers, did not gamble her reputation on impulse. But 3 hours earlier, her board had discovered her husband had left her, not died, not divorced her quietly, but vanished 2 weeks before the gala that would decide whether investors trusted her enough to save the company her father built. A married CEO was stable. A CEO publicly abandoned was prey. She needed a husband for one night. And Daniel Reyes, a man she had watched help an elderly tenant carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs in her own building, was the only person she trusted not to ask for anything in return. Mr. Reyes. Her voice was steady, but her hands, folded in front of her, were not. I need you to be my husband tonight. Nothing more. I will pay you enough to cover 6 months of your daughter's expenses, and you will never have to explain yourself to anyone. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had learned, since his wife left, never to trust an offer that sounded too generous. Why me? Because you've never asked me for anything, Vivian said quietly. And tonight, that's exactly what I need. He should have said no. He thought of Mia's school shoes, 2 sizes too small, and he said yes. The gala unfolded like a performance neither of them had rehearsed enough. Cameras flashed. Investors smiled with teeth too white to be sincere. Daniel learned quickly that survival meant mirroring her, a hand at the small of her back, a laugh half a second behind hers, eyes that never left her face when she spoke. He was good at it, frighteningly good, because somewhere between the 7th and 8th toast, he stopped performing and started genuinely listening to the way her voice cracked, almost imperceptibly, whenever someone asked about her husband's whereabouts. It was in the coat room, away from the lights, that he first saw the truth crack through. Vivian's phone buzzed, and her face drained of color. She didn't answer it. Everything all right? Daniel asked. My daughter's school called, she said, before catching herself, eyes wide with the realization of what she'd revealed. Daniel went still. You have a daughter. Vivian's composure, the armor she'd worn since she was 23 years old and inherited a company built to consume people like her, finally slipped. She's 8. No one knows. If the board finds out I have a child outside of any marriage they sanctioned, they will say I'm unfit, that I let emotion run a company built on numbers. I built a story to protect her. Tonight was supposed to be the final piece of it. He didn't ask the obvious question, where the child's father was. He simply said, what's her name? Sophie. For the first time all evening, Vivian Callaway smiled like a mother instead of a CEO. The gala's second hour brought the storm. A journalist named Patrick Hale, sharp-eyed and unkind, cornered them near the orchestra, his recorder already running. Funny, he said. I couldn't find a single marriage certificate for the two of you. Care to comment? Daniel felt Vivian's hand tighten around his arm, not in panic, but in calculation, the same instinct that had kept her company alive through 3 hostile takeovers. Patrick, she said evenly, you'll have your story when I decide to give it to you, not when you decide to invent one. But the question had planted itself in the room like a seed in dry soil, and by the time the second course was served, whispers had become a current pulling at every conversation. Daniel watched her hold the room together, with nothing but posture and presence, and he understood, with sudden clarity, that the woman beside him wasn't performing strength. She had simply never been allowed to be anything else. Near midnight, Vivian excused herself to the terrace, and Daniel found her there alone, her heels abandoned beside a stone railing, the city lights smeared by rain below them. "I had a husband once," she said, before he could ask. "Marcus. We married for the company, stayed for Sophie, and when she turned 6, he told me he was loved either of us. That he stayed because leaving would have cost him more than staying. He left 2 weeks ago. I told the board he was traveling for business. I have been lying to $9 billion worth of investors for 14 days. Daniel sat beside her, careful, the way he'd learned to sit beside Mia when nightmares came. "You don't have to lie to me. I don't know how to do anything else anymore," Vivian admitted. And for a moment, the most powerful woman in the room looked smaller than his 6-year-old daughter ever had. It was foreshadowed earlier, in the coat room, in the way she'd flinched at her own phone. But the full weight of it landed now. Vivian wasn't protecting her empire. She was protecting the only person who had never asked anything of her either. The next morning brought the consequence neither of them had prepared for. Patrick Hale published a story, not about the missing husband, but about Daniel, a single father, a part-time handyman, photographed entering Callaway Tower in a suit too small for his shoulders. The headline asked the question the gala had only whispered: who is Vivian Callaway's real husband? The board called an emergency meeting. Daniel's sister called him in tears, saying reporters had shown up outside her building asking about Mia. Daniel arrived at Callaway Tower uninvited. Fury and fear knotted together in his chest. "They're at my sister's door. My daughter is 6 years old, and there are cameras outside her window." Vivian's face was pale, but her voice didn't waver. "I'll fix this. I'll release a statement saying you were paid for an appearance, that there's no real relationship. And what happens to Mia when the cameras decide that story's not interesting enough and start digging into why a single dad needed money badly enough to fake a marriage?" Daniel's voice cracked on the last word, and Vivian, who had spent 14 days protecting her own daughter from exposure, finally understood the cost she'd asked him to carry without asking. The darkest moment arrived in silence. Daniel drove home that night, convinced he'd made the worst decision of his life, that he'd traded his daughter's privacy for a few months of rent. Vivian sat alone in her office as the board voted to suspend her pending an internal review of leadership integrity, the same board that had smiled at her for a decade while she carried their company alone. 2 locked doors, 2 parents, both certain they had failed the children they loved most. It was Sophie who broke the silence. 8 years old, she found her mother crying for the first time in her life and asked the question no investor, no journalist, no board member had ever dared to ask. "Mom, why do you have to pretend to be happy all the time?" Vivian called Daniel that night, not to apologize, but to tell the truth, the full truth, recorded, sent directly to every major outlet before the board could spin it first. She admitted the marriage was fake, admitted Sophie existed, admitted she had led a company, define what kind of mother and what kind of woman she was allowed to be. And she said, on record, that the only person who had treated her like a human being in 14 noise was a single father who had never once asked her for anything beyond honesty. The fallout was not clean. Board members resigned, stock dipped before steadying. Patrick Hale wrote a second story, this time about courage instead of scandal. But Daniel watched, 3 days later, as Vivian showed up at his sister's apartment door, Sophie's hand in hers. No security, no cameras, no armor. "I'm not asking you to be my husband," Vivian said. "I'm asking if Sophie can meet Mia. I'm asking if I can stop pretending, starting with you." Mia, peeking from behind her father's leg, looked up at Sophie with the easy curiosity only children possess, and asked if she wanted to see her stuffed rabbit. Sophie said yes. Daniel looked at Vivian. Not the CEO from the headlines, not the woman from the gala, just a mother standing in a hallway with her shoes in her hand again, this time by choice. "Yeah," he said. "Let's stop pretending." The rain had stopped outside, and for the first time in 14 days, Vivian Callaway walked into a room without rehearsing what she was supposed to say.